This week, I was working on a project and a design that required me to take the first post inside of a post grid and make it featured so it stood out and was styled differently than the rest of the post in the post loop. Now, I had a couple hacky ways to achieve this, but I'd never actually taken the time to figure out the more proper way to do this. And thankfully, this design actually forced me to go in and figure out the right way to get this done. So in this video, I thought I'd share what I came up with to be able to feature a post inside of your post loop. Now, if that sounds like something that'd be interesting to you, stick around and let's get started. So let's start off by just building everything out from scratch. That way you're really familiar with the structure of this, which is going to come in handy later down the road. So to get started, I'm just going to add a container to my page with an inner container. I do have a utility class set up here for a default section, which is just going to give us some vertical and horizontal padding. Now inside of this wrapper, I want to go ahead and add our query loop, and we're just going to start out blank. Now as we go through this, there are some things we're going to have to set at the block level, while other things we're going to set at the class level. Anytime I can, I'm going to take advantage of using the class level and the global styles, but there's some things that we have to set here at the block level, and I'll try to point those out as we go through. So here inside our query loop, the first thing we'll have to do at the block level is change this grid item width. I'm going to go ahead and change this to 33% because we want to have a 3-column grid here. Now inside of our card, I want to have an image, so I'm going to go ahead and add an image. Underneath that, I'm going to want to add a container, which is going to kind of wrap our headline and excerpt. And so we'll go ahead and add that headline, and we'll add another headline block and change the tag to a paragraph, and that's going to act as our excerpt. Now the first thing I notice is we need a little bit of space in between all these, so we'll go back to our grid here. The grid actually doesn't have global styles controls, so we're going to have to edit these at the block level, and we'll just add 32 pixels of both horizontal and vertical gap. Now let's go ahead and give classes to everything we can, so that way we make sure that we're styling things at the class level, which is going to be a lot better for scalability long term. So we'll go ahead here to our post template, and we'll give this the class of blog-card. We're going to roughly follow a BIM naming convention, which is just going to make it easier for us to remember the names of everything inside of our classes. Here for our image, we'll do blog-card _image. For our content wrapper here, we'll do blog-card, and I'm going to call this details-wrapper. The headline here, we'll do blog-card _title. And lastly, for our excerpt, we'll do blog-card _excerpt. And hit create. Now we got classes on everything, so we can make sure that we style things at the class level whenever available. Of course, we need to bring in our dynamic data. So I'm going to go ahead and go here to the image and enable our dynamic data and change the image source to our featured image. So that's going to bring in the featured image of all of our posts. Here for our headline, we'll do the same thing, but change the content source to our title. And lastly, for our excerpt, I'm going to change the dynamic data and make this our excerpt, which is going to bring in the excerpt of the post. Now we can start talking about how we want to style this. First of all, I don't want this excerpt to be so long, so I'm going to say maybe something like 15, and we're going to turn off the default read more link. I think the size of the text is great here, so there's really no other changes I want to make to that. Let's go ahead and go here to our title, and I think this text is actually a little bit too big. This works for our H2 and other places, but in context of this card, I think it's too big. So let's go ahead and go to our blog-card _title, and we're going to go into our typography, and maybe we do 1.75 rem, which makes it just a tiny bit smaller, but in my opinion, quite a bit better. I also think we could get rid of some of this bottom margin our title has by default. So again, inside of our blog card title, we'll go to spacing, and under the bottom margin, I'm going to override this to maybe 4 pixels, which tightens that up a little bit. Now we got rid of spacing here, but I think we do need a little bit of spacing between our image and the text underneath it. So I'm going to go here to our blog card details wrapper, edit that class, go into our spacing, and I'm going to do maybe 16 pixels of top padding, which is just going to give us a little bit of space in between that text and the image. Now these first 3 images seem to be about the same aspect ratio, but you can see this one down here is quite a bit taller. If it were here with the rest of our posts, in fact, we can fake that. I'll just go ahead and add an offset here of 1. And you can see now our third image here is quite a bit taller than the rest, and that doesn't look great. I'll go ahead and delete this offset. We'll go here to our image. We'll make sure we're targeting our image class and go down here to media, and we're gonna set a specific aspect ratio. I like doing this more than giving it an explicit size because this will just make sure that it maintains that same aspect ratio at all different breakpoints. Here, I'm gonna do 16/9, which is a pretty common aspect ratio and exactly what you see here inside this YouTube video. Here, I need to also make sure we change the object fit to cover. That way our images aren't squished. Now, before we go on to start styling our featured posts, we need to make sure this is looking good at all different breakpoints. Here, I'm gonna go to tablet, and I think we actually need a 2-column grid here instead. So I'm gonna go back to the post template, and here at the block level, I'm gonna change that to a 50% grid. Down at the mobile version, I think we need to go to a 1-column grid, so I'm gonna change that to 100%. Everything else I think looks pretty great. So as far as we're concerned, these default post stylings are done. So now let's talk about how we actually feature this first item inside of our loop. I ran into this scenario the other day on a build. My first instinct was just go to this query loop and duplicate it, go to the very first one and change the post per page to 1 so that it only shows 1 post, and go to the second query loop, add a parameter, and add an offset of 1 so it didn't show that same first post twice. Now this works here in this scenario, but creating extra query loops and extra calls to the database isn't exactly the most performant way to go. And you actually run into another problem, which is the ultimate reason why I went with the solution that I'm going to be showing you here today. If I wanted to use this same featured post inside of my category archive page, I'm unable to do 2 different query loops because you actually need to toggle on the inherit query loop from template. And I'm actually glad this forced me to think a little bit harder about what I was doing, because what I ended up figuring out is a lot better all around. So let's go back here into what we had originally. I'm going to delete the second version and we'll get rid of this limiting posts per page to 1. Now what we're going to need to be able to do is target the first item inside of our post loop only. And I've gone back and forth whether to show you this inside the new global styles or to just write the CSS. And there's a couple reasons I've decided that we're just going to go ahead and write all the CSS. First of all, we're going to have to use a first child selector, which doesn't always behave well inside the editor. Secondly, you'd really have to know how all these underlying things work with CSS in order to push all the right buttons and levers inside the editor, so I think it just makes sense to write all the CSS here first. Now, if you're not used to writing CSS, don't worry, I'm going to try to make this as simple as possible so that you can use this confidently inside your builds. So let's take a look at what we need to do to get this all started. We need to do one more thing before we leave the editor, which is go here to our post grid and give this a class. Again, we don't have the global styles options here for our grid block, so we'll have to go in here into the advanced and under additional CSS classes. I'm just going to call this post grid. With that, we'll go ahead and hit update on this page. We'll view it on the front end and we'll jump into the customizer to start writing our CSS. Now, like I said, what we need to do is target only the first item inside of our loop. We just gave our grid the class of post grid, so I'm going to go ahead and type that in here first. Now, to select that first child, we want to go ahead and use our direct descendant selector, and we need to target GB grid column. Now, you might be wondering where this class is coming from, and it's actually a class that's attached to our individual columns inside the grid block. You can't see that from the back end, but if you ever inspected the page, you would see that's attached to one of the containers here. Let's go ahead and add an outline of 1 pixel solid, just so we can see what we're targeting. Obviously, right now we're targeting each one of the items inside of our grid, so we need to change this to target only the first one. We'll do that by adding a colon here and typing in first hyphen child. Now, as you can see, our outline is only being applied to the first item inside this group. Don't worry about this extra padding on the left. That's just the way these flexbox columns are set up, and that's not going to get in our way later on. But it's really important to see now that we're actually able to target just this first item in our loop, and this is going to unlock the possibility of making this first item a featured item. But let's go ahead and talk about how we target all the other classes for all the pieces inside this card. I'm going to go ahead and grab this entire selector here and copy it, and we'll go down on a new line and paste it. Now we have to think back to all the class names we gave each element inside of our card. The first one was just blog card. Now I'll change this outline to green just so we can see a differentiator here. You can see our blog card is now actually being outlined in a solid green color. Let's go ahead and set up the selectors for each one of our elements just so we get used to the practice of doing that, and it will make it easier later as we need to target each of these elements as we're doing our styling. So inside of the blog card, we had a _image, which is going to target just that image. You can see the faint green line there. Maybe if we bump it up a little bit, you can see it. We'll copy this. We'll paste it again. And because we used BIM naming conventions, it's really easy to target everything in here. The next thing was our details wrapper, which we can see now gets an outline. We'll change this to purple. Don't worry, we'll get rid of all these outlines later. I just want to give you some kind of visuals so you can see what we're targeting here. Inside the blog card, we also had our title, which you can see now gets an outline. And lastly, we had our excerpt. So we'll go ahead and type in excerpt, and our excerpt gets the outline here. So now that we can see we're targeting everything properly, let's go ahead and just get rid of all these outlines because we don't really need those as part of our design. So now let's make some decisions on how we want to feature this first card. What I'm thinking is that we make the first card stretch the entire width of the container instead of being a 33% column. So to do that, I'm going to go here to our first selector, which is just this first child, and I'm going to do a width of 100%. Now you can see now this first post takes up 100% of our container, while the rest of them still stay at their 33%. Now this right here might be enough for you, but we're gonna go and explore different ways we can really change up this design. Instead of having the text be all the way down here at the bottom, which might get cut off on different screens, I think I actually want the text and the image to be side by side. To do that, I'm gonna go here to our blog card selector, and we're gonna change this display to flex. That will go ahead and put the image and the text next to each other, since by default, display flex is going to be a flex direction of row. Now this looks okay, but I don't really like the way this image is kind of not aligning up with the rest, and I think it should be more of a 50-50 split, with the image taking up 50% and the details wrapper taking up the other 50%. So we'll go here to our blog card details wrapper, and I'm going to change this width to 50%. Now as you can see, it changed, but it didn't change the way we expected it to. That's because we actually need to tell this image to be 50% as well, but unfortunately we can't just tell the image here. If I went here and went with width of 50%, you can see this isn't behaving exactly like we had hoped. That's because there's actually a somewhat invisible wrapper here around our image, which is a figure tag. To grab that, I'm just gonna go ahead and copy the selector we had for our image, but instead of blog card _image, I'm gonna just change this to figure. If we go here and we do a width of 50%, you can see now the image is taking up 50% and the details wrapper is taking up 50%. Now we might go too deep in the woods if we start talking about this figure selector, but anytime you use the image block inside GenerateBlocks, it's going to be wrapped in this figure tag. If you go and inspect the page from the front end, you will be able to see that. All right, let's continue styling this. I think that the text over here in the details wrapper needs a little bit more padding around it so it's not squished up against the image. So since we created all of our selectors already, we can go find this blog card details wrapper and we'll change this padding to, I don't know, let's say 40 pixels, which I think that looks pretty good. However, I do think it needs to be centered inside this column here, so we can go back to our blog card where we changed it to display flex, and we can do align items center. This is going to fix our problem for now, but later down the line, we're actually going to have to change this because it's going to give us some problems as we get to our mobile responsive versions. There are a couple more tweaks I want to make to the desktop version here. One, I think this font should actually be bigger for the title so it stands out more in comparison to these other cards. We've already gone ahead and created our blog card title selector. So for here, I'll just say a font size and maybe we'll do 2.25 rem. And that's quite a bit bigger than the others, so we can really see this is standing out now. The last thing I want to do is add a border around this entire card here. So we'll go back to our blog card. We'll do a border, 1 pixel solid, and I'm going to choose one of the variables from our color palette, which is contrast 3, which is a nice light gray color. Now with all these things set up, I think this first post really stands out from the others. Let's take a look at what this looks like on our responsive versions though. When I go here to tablet, we can see we have a problem with our image. And when we go to mobile, that problem is really exaggerated. So let's talk about how we might be able to fix that. Actually, before we do that, I think the image should go on the right and the text on the left, and we can do that by changing our flex direction here for the blog card. Like I said, by default, the flex direction is set to row, which is what we want because we want these side by side, but we actually want to reverse the order. So to do that, we'll do flex direction and we'll do row hyphen reverse. And this will actually flip-flop the image and the text here. And I think this is more of the look I'm going for. But still, we have the problem with our tablet and mobile versions, which don't look great. So let's talk about how we're going to fix that. The reason this image is kind of squished down in the middle is because we've set this to be a align items of center, which is center aligning it. You can see if we get rid of that, it actually puts it at the top. So that's one issue we have. The other issue we have is this image is locked into that 16:9 aspect ratio, which isn't allowing it to stretch to the top and bottom. So we're going to have to override that as well. So let's talk about how we'll do this. Instead of doing align items center, I'm going to do an align items of stretch. This gives us the ability for this image to take up the entire height. All we need to do is override that aspect ratio by going here to our blog card image and doing a height of 100%, which is going to override that aspect ratio of 16:9 we had before. Now our image takes up the entire height, and it's still inheriting the object fit of cover, which is making sure that it doesn't squish our images. So if we go back to desktop here, we can see our image still looks great. And here on tablet, it's taking up the full height of the card, which is exactly what we wanted. Of course, we did create a bit of a problem here. Now our text isn't center aligned with the image since we changed that align items to stretch. But that's actually easy to fix as well. I'm going to go here to our blog card details wrapper, and we're going to change this to a display of flex as well. Of course, we don't want these side by side, so we need to do a flex direction of column, which is going to stack them back on top of each other. Now it looks like we're just back to where we started, but now this gives us the ability to justify our content in the center, which is going to place these items vertically back center inside of this container. So at this point, I think both our desktop and tablet versions look great, but when we get to mobile, we have a little bit to be desired. This is actually really easy to fix with a media query. Here at the bottom of our CSS, I'm going to do an @media. We'll do a max width of 768 pixels, which is the breakpoint in GeneratePress for the mobile version. And we'll go ahead and open and close our parentheses. Now, what I'm thinking is we need to go ahead and put the image on top of the text again. So we need to go back and find these selectors. What we're going to need to target is this blog card. So I'm just going to go ahead and grab all this CSS here and go ahead and copy it to my clipboard so we can paste it inside of our media query. Here inside the flex direction, we no longer want row, we want column because we want these two containers to stack top and bottom. So instead of row of reverse, we're going to do column, which will now make this stack on top of each other, which is exactly what we wanted. However, you can see this is no longer taking up the full width of this container, so there's some more work that we need to have done. If you remember, we went and made the figure 50% width and the blog card details wrapper 50% width. So we need to grab both of those here. We'll go ahead and grab this figure first, make sure we're outside of that blog card selector, but still inside of our media query. And we can change this to 100%, which is going to make the image span 100% of our column again. And we can go here to our blog card details wrapper. Again, we'll copy that outside of that figure selector, but still inside of our media query. We'll paste that in and we'll do a width of 100%. Now we're getting a lot closer to what we want, but I think this padding is a little bit big and I think we need to reset this font size back to what it was before. So we'll go up and steal this details wrapper selector again. We'll paste it in here and maybe we'll do a padding of 24 pixels. Which seems more appropriate for this mobile version. And lastly, we need to grab the headline so we can change the font size. So we'll go up here and grab the title selector, paste it here inside of our media query, and we'll do a font size of 1.75 rem, which is back to what we had for these other versions here. Now, if we take a look at our tablet, it has not been affected by all these changes because we wrote these inside of a media query that only affects our mobile version. And same for our desktop, it's looking great just like it did before. Now, we could have actually approached this a little bit differently, and instead of writing this media query to overwrite all the things from mobile, we could have stuck all of these declarations inside of a media query for just the desktop and tablet versions. But in this case, it's 6 of one, half a dozen of the other. We still would have needed to write some overrides for both different versions. So I chose in this demo to only use the media query for the mobile version since it was the fewest amount of changes. But you could always go the other direction, and an argument could be made for going either way. So let's go ahead and hit publish. We'll exit the editor here and jump into the inspector so we can see how all of this changes as the width of our viewport changes. Here in desktop, it's side by side. And now when it snaps to tablet, we can see this goes to a 2-column grid while this remains the full 100% width. And once we get under that 768 breakpoint here, this goes to a single column where our mobile media query options are taking over that have kind of tightened this padding and changed this font size back to something more appropriate. Now here in this video, I chose to show you how you could target the first child inside the post grid, but you could just as easily use the same method to target the last child or even every other child inside the grid. There are really no limits to how you can use this to target different things inside your post loop. In fact, the category of your post is actually attached to the post item itself, so you could even use the same method to target certain categories within your post loop. Like if you wanted to feature your case studies, for example, you could style those differently using a very similar method to what we did here today. Hopefully you learned something new in this video. If you did, I would really appreciate a thumbs up. And if you want to make sure to keep up with all the latest in GeneratePress and GenerateBlocks, then hit subscribe and we'll see you in the next video.